Okay, hello everyone. Okay, so today I'll be presenting the essay I had the opportunity to work on and research while I was studying abroad last semester at Oxford. So here we go. What I'm going to do is kind of read through the bulk of my research, and then afterwards we'll go through each panel. Okay. Ever since the Franks Casket appeared onto the stage in the early 19th century, the artifact has become an internationally famed enigma. The nature and meaning of the imagery and the runic riddles have left scholars and ordinary viewers fascinated and truly puzzled by its mysterious purpose and origins. The panels of the box depict seemingly conflicting Germanic, pagan, and Judeo-Christian scenes. The riddling and fluctuation of languages are comically confusing, and the three-dimensional carvings of whalebone are truly beautiful works of art that encourage one to reach out and touch it. The Franks Casket, more specifically speaking, is also a unique example of the significance of material culture in Anglo-Saxon England, and beautifully illustrates the ways in which the people of this period were able to combine text, image, and object to tell their stories and express their culture and customs. So imagine a historical narrative of England without the presence of illuminated manuscripts, intricate brooches and pins, swords and shields or stone crosses and sculptures, a narrative in which material culture is almost obsolete. Things, literally physical objects and artifacts, like the Franks Casket you can see here, are the most valuable sources and tools we have to understand Anglo-Saxon society, because they were not only symbols of power and authority, but also artistic expressions of culture and physical bearers of ideas and meaning. This essay in my research explores some mysterious intricacies and meanings surrounding the images and the runic riddles of the Franks Casket. But more importantly, it will examine what the Franks Casket can tell us about the nature and role of material culture in Anglo-Saxon society. So in my research of the Franks Casket, thing theory was the main methodological framework that I used to approach the object itself. So thing theory is an incredibly helpful method when approaching and attempting to understand material culture of the distant past. It may be especially useful when applied to an object like the Franks Casket. The purpose of thing theory is to mold meaning and material culture together and gain a more vivid and complete understanding of historical artifacts and objects, by not only viewing these objects as finite and outdated pieces of a foreign past, but by recognizing the voice and agency that non-human things have across time. Historian James Paz has championed the use of thing theory in his recent work concerning the nature of the riddles and images of the Franks Casket, by pushing historians and scholars to re-examine the concept of voice in material culture. Anglo-Saxons seem to understand the concept of voice in a very different way than we do today. They understood their ability to use objects and things to speak and actually tell stories, to express their beliefs and reflect their culture in very long-lasting ways. So here's a little bit of the known background of the box and its discovery. So the casket itself is actually dated to the first half of the 8th century AD, and it suddenly reappeared in Ozon, France around the year 1859. It's widely believed that it became to France at some point during the Anglo-Saxon period, either by a private individual or through trade with the Frankish kingdoms, which was very common at the time. So most scholars also believe that the casket came to Ozon in particular after surviving some of the destruction to churches during the French Revolution. Unfortunately, the brass fittings for the box were lost, causing the panels to slowly come apart and be separated over time. But luckily, all of the panels except for the right-hand panel were collected and bought in Paris by Sir Augustus Franks, who the casket was named for. He was also the keeper of the British and medieval collections at the British Museum, which is how it came to the British Museum. Although the story of its resurfacing is quite intriguing, the history of the box itself before it suddenly reappeared in France is an absolute mystery. We most likely owe its survival to it having been a prestigious gift or possession of a church or ecclesiastical community or even a wealthy family. So because of our inability to clearly and decisively determine the meaning behind the images and some of the inscriptions on the casket itself, its purpose, its context, and its actual use, it's really difficult for archaeologists to figure out. So like I said, although its exact origins are unknown, scholarship has largely agreed that the casket seems to be the work of Northumbrian craftsmanship. I believe the casket may be linked to the craftsmanship of the monasteries of Wilfrid of York, which is highly probable considering its similarities in shape and style to other known Christian reliquaries and pieces of the period in the region. Wilfrid, like Benedict Biscop, who was the founder of the Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow Monastery in England, often traveled back and forth to the continent and the Mediterranean, bringing back objects, ideas, and culture that served as inspiration for material culture, which were created in so many of the Northumbrian monasteries. So for example, the chest is clearly modeled on similar ivory, chests, and caskets of the late antique period of the Mediterranean and the Roman world, and also may have contributed to the unique fusion of Roman and Germanic scenes that you can see throughout the casket. The theory of the casket's 8th century origins is strengthened also by the artistry and cultural diversity found in other material culture of the region, most notably in illuminated manuscripts. So illuminated manuscripts also feature imagery reminiscent of both the Roman and Germanic heritage. Historians and scholars have worked tirelessly to determine the nature of the Franks casket, to categorize the distinct panels in the images as either Christian or pagan, Roman or Germanic, and to interpret whether or not it belonged to a private individual or served an ecclesiastical purpose. We still don't know. It is possible that the casket could have been the work of a monastery for a wealthy patron, possibly a nobleman or a king, and it was either used at their residence or remained at a church or ecclesiastical community in order to hold relics or other sacred objects. James Paz, however, who I already described as being a strong advocate for the application of thing theory, rejects what he believes is a futile task of determining its function and birthplace, and instead argues that strict categorization and attempts to separate the meaning of the box from the scenes and inscriptions is entirely counterproductive to actually understanding the Franks casket. He treats the entire box itself as a riddle. While his perception and analysis of the casket may border on romantic at times, his emphasis that the casket should be viewed as more than an old object, but instead the actual voice and physical expression of a people and their culture through time is a useful method to apply during the study of material culture from Anglo-Saxon England as a whole. Things are such an intrinsic part of Anglo-Saxon tradition and society due to the deep connection between image and meaning in their culture. Imagery was an invaluable tool during this period, not only because of its power to bear meaning, ideas, and emotion in beautifully artistic ways, but also because of its ability to convey messages to a largely illiterate population. Material culture was therefore multifunctional. It aided secular and political, the higher and lower classes, and the religious sectors of Anglo-Saxon society. The various influences and cultural traditions illustrated by the carved scenes you can see throughout the casket may also reflect the unique fusion of various cultures and traditions within Anglo-Saxon society itself. The Anglo-Saxons were undoubtedly influenced by both the Celtic Church in Ireland and the Roman Church in the Mediterranean. However, the casket should not be limited by the assumption that it is just another piece of Christian art from the Golden Age of Northumbria. The traditions and legends of Germanic pagan past have influenced the casket just as much as the Christian present, much like Anglo-Saxon culture and society itself. Pagan Germanic traditions and tales were inherent to Anglo-Saxon identity, whether they were converted to Christians or not. The presence of imagery referencing Roman legend and Judeo-Christian history, such as the Romulus and Remus scene, or even the sacking of Jerusalem on the back panel, reflect a creator and culture that is aware of its roots in the East as well, an understanding of the part that Rome has also played in shaping their identity. So although I have stressed the uncertainty surrounding the origins of the casket, scholarship has largely agreed that it seems to be the creation of a well-educated group. The imagery draws on very diverse international sources for inspiration, and few sectors of Anglo-Saxon society would have had access to that kind of knowledge or education at the time, besides the monasteries and the famous scriptoriums of Northumbria. Intriguingly, the casket does not seem to follow any chronological or narrative order, therefore the panels can be read and interpreted freely, meaning and interpretation likely differing on the panels in which one begins and ends. So for example, historian Leslie Webster, in her examination of the images and the runic riddles of the box, views the front panel as not two distinct panels, but instead as twin scenes, meant to be viewed in tandem. She applies this method to the rest of the casket, analyzing the left and right-hand panels together, and then the lid and the back panels together. In this case, the way in which one follows the story being told by the images and the runic inscriptions matters a great deal. One either views the panels as contradictions or as twin scenes meant to send one coherent message. So let us now explore a few of the panels in greater detail, beginning with the front panel, which is the most popular and intriguing of them all, I believe. So it's because of these period scenes that the popular method of viewing specific panels in tandem became really common practice in viewing the casket itself. So on the panel, there are two very distinct scenes taking place simultaneously. The first carving on the left side of the panel, right here, depicts a scene from the popular Germanic legend of Wayland the Smith. The story of Wayland was wildly popular during this period, the hero making numerous appearances in various Old Norse and Old English stories. Wayland, exiled and cruelly held prisoner by the evil King Nithad, in his anger decides to take revenge on his captor by murdering the king's sons and impregnating his daughter. Before escaping with wings constructed from birds, which you can see in the right-hand side right there, he attempts to give the king poisoned beer in a goblet made from the skull of the king's dead son. In the scene, King Nithad, right here, is depicted holding a skull cup drugged by Wayland from the decapitated body of the king's son that you can see lying at his feet. So here you see the king's son, and you see the skull cup right there. Okay, this scene is but one in a series of panels portraying a juxtaposition of revenge and judgment. So if we then move to the right-hand side of the front panel, right here, you can see a very different Christian scene taking place, the Adoration of the Magi. So this scene is clearly identified by a runic label reading Magi, right here, above the three figures as they approach what is clearly Mary and Christ on a throne. One feature that is particularly noteworthy in this scene is the unusual depiction of Mary and Christ as one. If you look, Christ appears to be enveloped by Mary. Many have suggested that this style of portrayal in iconography is typically identified with representations of the Incarnation and can be seen in other pieces of religious art in the Roman world and the Mediterranean. For example, there is a very popular depiction of this similar image in the Santa Maria Antica in Rome. Historians and scholars have put an incredible amount of effort into deciphering the relatedness of the panels, often using the front panel as a starting point for their comparisons, as I've just described. So for now, I'm going to leave the detailed description of each of the panels and come back to those in a few moments. So again, we will speak of voices and the concept of voice in material culture. Voices in Anglo-Saxon England have survived the centuries through their inscriptions and presence on more than just manuscripts and books, but material culture as well, on caskets, weapons, crosses, columns, stone sculpture, and so much more. The text of the Franks Casket works together with the images and scenes depicted on the panels to form a unique meaning and story, despite the complicated fusion of various traditions and cultures. The creator, or the creators, of the casket skillfully combined images with both verbal and visual riddles to deliver one coherent message and story. The story it is telling, though, has become a sort of conundrum to historians and archaeologists who attempt to decipher it. The casket has become notorious as a kind of ancient puzzle or Rubik's Cube. One of the greatest gifts the Franks Casket has granted us, so, is an illustration of how important the genre of riddles were to Anglo-Saxon culture. Riddles were an entire literary and oral genre, often used in either first or third person to give voice to something which otherwise would not speak, the ability to tell its own story. Literary and poetic riddles were not only fun plays on words, but was also metaphorical language used to actively engage the reader and force them to read more carefully. In the words of Paz, the riddle in Anglo-Saxon culture is, quote, a multi-sensory and multi-dimensional endeavor, end quote. The greatest example of this can be seen on the front panel of the casket, as you can see around the image here, and refers to the physical creation of the box. In Old English runes, it reads, the fish beat up the seas onto the mountainous cliff. The king of terror became sad when he swam aground onto the shingle. Whale's bone. The inscription is intriguing for multiple reasons. It is obviously describing the whalebone used to make the casket, but the riddle gives the whale its own voice and ability to describe its journey and its fate to become the casket. Instead of viewing the box as a series of carved images on panels, the Franks Casket can also be examined as a three-dimensional series of riddles that's also accompanied by panels and images. On each panel of the casket, there are inscriptions or runic riddles, like the one you see here, in various languages and scripts, sometimes moving from Old English and Anglo-Saxon runes to Latin and then into the Roman alphabet. Sometimes they're backwards, sometimes they're upside down. The back panel of the casket, which depicts the capture of Jerusalem by Emperor Titus, also features a very unusual inscription above the main section of the upper scene. The main inscription begins in Old English runes and then shifts into Latin and then into the Roman alphabet before suddenly shifting back into runes, which I'll show you in a moment. One of the most important inscriptions to interpreting the imagery of the casket, however, is the inscription surrounding the unidentifiable scene on the right-hand panel of the casket, which I'll show you in a moment. The Germanic tale in which the scene was derived must be lost to history because we don't know what it's actually depicting. On the panel, you can see a horse in the center, a female holding a rod and a goblet, and they're both standing over what appears to be a burial mound. Around the burial mound, they're also surrounded by strange mythological half-man, half-beast creatures. The inscription itself is a strange alliterative verse of cryptic runes reading, "Here Hall sits on the sorrow mound. She suffers distress as Urcha had imposed it upon her, a wretched den of sorrows and torments of mind." The inscription offers limited help in interpreting the scene, but the mood and theme of the carving still penetrates our unknowing. There is clearly an emphasis on death and suffering in the pagan scene, and it may be further proof of the theory that the Germanic and Christian scenes are purposely juxtaposed to promote the message of salvation and redemption from pagan ways. So although new discoveries in the work of many historians and scholars and archaeologists do provide fresh perspectives and new information, the Franks Casket still remains an enigma to this day. In this essay, I've described the numerous ways in which one can view the panels and follow the story of the casket as either juxtaposed scenes working to promote one message, or as beautiful contradictions to fuse multiple cultures and traditions into one masterpiece. There is no right or wrong way to follow the story of the casket. Although the Franks Casket is now protected behind glass at the British museums, the three-dimensional beauty of the carved images in the runes were meant to be engaging to the viewer, combining the element of reading with actual physical touch. The famous Argentine poet and writer, Jorge Luis Borges, moved by the mystery of the carvings in the runes, visited the British museums at the end of his life after he had gone completely blind for the special intention of touching the casket before he passed. Despite the many mysteries concerning the meaning of the imagery in the riddling inscriptions, the invaluable glimpse that the casket has given us of Anglo-Saxon culture is no mystery at all. Material culture was incredibly important to Anglo-Saxon society. They spoke and told their stories through these ornate carvings and artistic details of things and objects. The Anglo-Saxon world, and the historical narrative of England, and the Western world in its entirety, will look entirely unfamiliar without things and material objects like illuminated manuscripts, stonework, brooches and jewelry, and objects like the Franks Casket that tell us their story. Okay, so now we will go through each of the panels. So we've already gone through the front panel in pretty good detail. Okay, so we'll now start with the right-hand side of the casket, which is the Romulus and Remus scene. So you can see here, in the center, you have two wolves and what appear to be two boys being suckled by the wolves. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the story of Romulus and Remus. They were the founders, the two brothers, of the ancient city of Rome. So this is a really unique depiction, actually, of a classical tale. And one of the only reasons that we know for certain that this scene is Romulus and Remus is actually the old runic inscription around the panel that you can see here. So the inscriptions actually say, "Romulus and Remus, two brothers, a she-wolf nourished them in Rome, far from their native land." Depictions of Romulus and Remus are actually very common throughout Anglo-Saxon society and art and Germanic culture. Not only because there were a long connection to Rome, but also because of the connection to the story of Hengist and Horsa. Those brothers, Hengist and Horsa, according to Germanic myth, were actually the founders of England. It's a story very similar to Romulus and Remus, but it's really interesting. If you guys are interested, I encourage you to go out and actually read that story. Okay, so if we move to the back panel, this is another one of the Franks Casket's more popular and intriguing panels. And it actually depicts the sacking of Jerusalem by the Emperor Titus around the year 70 AD. If we move, it's a bit brighter, hopefully you guys can see it a little bit better. So you can see here in the center of the panel, you have the Temple of Jerusalem. Inside the temple, you can actually see the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, being guarded by appears to be at the top, interlacing birds and eagles, which is actually very common in Anglo-Saxon art. You see it a lot in illuminated manuscripts. And then you actually see the winged bovines underneath in the temple. Those are actually very common. You can see them in the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells, if you guys are interested in those. But another interesting detail, and I describe this in my essay, this is actually the panel in which the inscriptions change languages throughout the panel. So we begin with Old English Anglo-Saxon runes, and then we actually shift into Latin and the Roman alphabet. So this panel can actually be seen as 4 separate sections as well. So in the top left-hand corner, you can see Emperor Titus leading the Roman legions into Jerusalem. In the right upper-hand corner, you can actually see Jews fleeing the city. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's an inscription that reads judgment. So we can see one figure actually seated in a chair right here, dispensing judgment after the sack of Jerusalem. And then in the right bottom hand corner, you can see actually hostages and slaves being taken from the city. Okay, so this is the infamous right-hand panel. It's actually really hotly debated exactly what this panel depicts. I talked about this in the essay, but here you can see the horse, the burial mound, and then this figure right here holding the rod and goblet. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the strange half-man, half-beast creatures. And then on the right side, we don't know what this is. It's 3 individuals standing together holding something, but again, we don't know. Some people actually believe it's just showing a very common Germanic story of a horse mourning a warrior. Other people believe that it's actually referencing the particular story of Sigurd, the Germanic story of the famous hero. Others believe it's actually another depiction of Horsa and Hengist. That one is a bit of a stretch, and it's actually a really complicated story. And then other people say that it's actually a Norse story that depicts a sacred deity of the grove. That one's super complicated, but this panel is super interesting, and I look forward to doing more research about it in the future. Okay, so here we have the lid, and I wanted to show you guys this image because you can see we actually don't have the upper and lower portions of the lid, so we don't exactly know what this scene is depicting. Here's a closer up image of it. So on the lid, you can clearly see you have a lone Bowman right here, guarding what appears to be a fortress from attack. Like I said, we don't know exactly what it is, but a lot of people actually believe that it's a depiction of Waylon's brother, Eagle, who may also be on the front panel. Again, the story that this scene actually is probably depicting, we don't have it. It's not recorded. But we do know that Eagle was a bowman, so it could be Eagle. Okay, so here's a picture of what the Franks Casket would have looked like in its heyday when it was originally created. If you've seen illuminated manuscripts, you know they're very colorful, they're very bright. So this looks a lot like one of those, and you can actually see what the brass fittings would have looked like as well. So I did try to order a physical replica of the casket for you guys to interact with and to actually see, but I guess the general public isn't as interested in this as I am, so there's not one out there. I did find one at the British Museum, which is this right here, but it cost over 700 pounds. So here's a picture of it. But if you guys are interested in any of the specific panels, or if you couldn't see a particular detail and you'd like to see it again, feel free to come up to me. I'd love to talk to you guys about it or show you guys a better image of it on my laptop. So thank you very much.